Hi there, my name's Clover. If you're new around here, this is a little project of mine where I just want to read as many public domain works as possible. I have a whole collection of gently used public domain works, and I like reading out loud because it just helps heal my inner child, since I loved it, but I think I wanted to be read aloud to more than I was as a kid. So, here we go. First text I'd like to tackle is Carmilla by Joseph Sheridan Fanu. I'm not sure if it was originally written in English, but I do know that this novel predated Dracula. I'm not sure by how many years, but it actually was a vampire novel, a queer one at that. I believe the two love interests are both women. And tonight I would like to read the introduction, the prologue, or at least the first chapter, the prologue and the introduction. You may hear me getting my sips of water. There may be a cat that comes by. I do not really want to edit any of the content here. Part of the experience is, well, peace of mind for me, since I don't really want this to be highly curated, stylized content. And I think part of the experience I want to be the sound of the pages being flipped, the coziness of a cat at my lap, or the annoyance. And yeah, we'll go from there. Carmilla by Joseph Sheridan Fanu, edited by Carmen Maria Machado. You Are Mine, Obsession, Odilic Influences, and Fanu's Carmilla. When Joseph Sheridan Fanu's magnum opus Carmilla was first published in installments in the dark blue in 1871, readers everywhere received it as fiction. When it later appeared in his collection of stories, In a Glass Darkly, the other accounts of Dr. Hesselius were evaluated similarly. Each new edition, adaptation, and reimagination of Carmilla has treated the correspondence between Dr. Hesselius and Laura as fictional artifact, an epistolary fabrication nested in layers of meta-commentary like a set of Russian nesting dolls. Sorry, just checking the camera for a second. It was not until 1973 that a scholar from the University of Iowa, Dr. Jane Late, revealed the full dimensions of this literary mystery during a research trip to Ireland. Nestled behind a hollow wall in Fanu's erstwhile study, she discovered a stack of correspondence between two individuals, an unnamed doctor and a woman who called herself only V. Accompanying these letters was the infamous introduction to Carmilla, penned in Fanu's hand. This was not the original manuscript that resided in the University of Leeds's special collection. Rather, it suggested that the narrative artifice literary scholars had been admiring for well over a century was not artifice at all. Within a few years' time, Dr. Late would have come to believe that Martin Hesselius and Lara were in fact pseudonyms for two quite real historical figures, Dr. Peter Fontenot and Veronica Hassel. Her research to uncover the true identities of the letter writers was extraordinarily thorough and has been artfully covered in great detail in Lucia Trecht's The Professor and the Vampire. Might check that out sometime. Dr. Peter Fontenot was the son of a Cajun haberdasher and a British railroad heiress. Though he had practiced medicine for many years, his second career as a kind of occult detective began in the early 1850s, when he moved to London to settle his late mother's affairs. In addition to his roles as doctor and collector of supernatural stories, he was also an amateur alchemist, and he was a contemporary of both Baron Vordenberg and a young Professor Abraham Van Helsing, another character whose real-life counterpart had his life's work undermined by the guise of fiction. Veronica Hassel, née Archer, was the daughter of an English soldier and a minor Hungarian noblewoman, best known not for her tangle with Carmilla, but her advocacy for women's agency in the realms of faith and medicine before her death in 1870. And what of the identity of the eponymous Carmilla? According to Dr. Late, Carmilla was, in fact, Marcia Marin, a young Spanish-Cuban aristocrat whose father sent her to Europe with her nursemaid and an eccentric governess during the beginning of the tensions that would eventually boil over into the 10 Years' War. This is all to say, just as Carmilla mercilessly pierced the breast of the young Laura, so Le Fanu drank of what was not his. To say that Laura, that is, Veronica, is a profoundly moving narrator is an understatement. She is by turns clever, vulnerable, awestruck, funny. Her loneliness is raw, her nascent desires familiar to any sexual creature. She is also not unlike Nabokov's Lolita, dead before the story begins. Carmilla is her coffin and headstone both. It would be no surprise if the reader inferred from the story that Veronica's offstage death was a result of the long and terrible ordeal she suffered at the hands of the vampiress Marcia. Yet nothing could be further from the truth. Married off to a Romanian viscount a few years later, Veronica died in childbirth, her fingers curled around the branch of a wild rose. An extraordinary life, an unextraordinary death. I feel like I should read these little notes. Let's see. Hold on. Let's go back and read some of the footnotes. Okay, the source of University of Pennsylvania. Footnote 2. There is no doubt that the events that inspired Dracula would have interested Dr. Fontenot tremendously, but he died of pulmonary tuberculosis in 1885, over a decade before its publication and well before its central events took place. Footnote 3. Though it has no particular bearing on either this introduction or the text, Veronica Hassel's great-granddaughter achieved her own measure of fame. She was acclaimed vocalist Madalena Deloni, born Sistana Carvoca, whose famous Argentinian recital in 1936 inspired the seminal work of neurophysicist Jeffrey Sonnabend, Obsolescence, Theories of Forgetting and the Problem of Matter. Footnote 4. From Amy Parker's Kingdom by the Sea on Lolita, the cruelest part is its introduction. Did you realize he killed her off? I didn't. Who reads an introduction? But it is true. Right away, without ceremony, he undoes her. He anticipates any attempts on the part of her readers to help her, to free her, to resist the text, by imagining her beyond its borders, by allowing her, perhaps, an adulthood. Before we ever meet her, he nails her down in her coffin. The book is her tomb. She's walled up in it. That's really sad. Let's see. There's another footnote here. Footnote 5. In Bram Stoker's Dracula, Professor Van Helsing uses a wild rose to immobilize the entombed vampire. In one of her unpublished letters, Veronica revealed that the wild rose was a symbol of affection between herself and Marcia. They left clipped branches for each other in their respective pillows. Oh, that's so cute. I wonder if that was also referenced. I read the book Priory of the Orange Tree, where the two main romantic interests, who are also both women, one of them left a rose beneath her pillow. The rose flower, no thorns. That could be a reference to that. Okay. Perhaps one of the most arresting moments in Carmilla occurs just before the titular vampiress's arrival. Upon returning from an evening walk with her father, Laura encounters her two governesses tittering like schoolgirls beneath the celestial splendor of a full moon. One of them, Mademoiselle de la Fontaine, relates the tale of her cousin, a sailor on a merchant ship, who once fell asleep beneath such a moon. He had awoken, she claimed, after a dream of an old woman clawing him by the cheek with his features horribly drawn to one side. His countenance had never quite recovered its equilibrium. She speaks, then, of the odyllic and magnetic influence of the night and the moon. The concept of odic forces, the pseudo-scientific philosophy of a pervading electromagnetic life force in all things, was very much in vogue in the mid-19th century. Footnote 6. Its principal researcher, Baron Dr. Karl Ludwig von Reichenbach, was responsible for several significant scientific advancements, including the invention of the first synthetic dye. Well, that's just neat. While Veronica never espoused or studied odology, she did adapt her governess's dogma in a very specific way. She believed that, in her dreams, she shared a physical space with certain other dreamers, fellow citizens of a shared dream city. It is believed by Lucia Trecht and other scholars that this accounted for her instant and profound love for Marcia. That is to say, she believed that even before they met, they had occupied the same dream city, and she believed that such a thing was as close to fate or destiny as you could come. To contemporary eyes, it is impossible to argue with the queer currents that run beneath Carmilla's text. The imposition of contemporary sexual understanding onto historical figures remains a sticking point for queer theorists and historians the world over. But there is far less ambiguity in the case of this particular text than one might think. There are, in fact, extant letters that did not make their way into Le Fanu's final story. And while Le Fanu says in his introduction that the now-dead Lara could not possibly have given more detail in her account, in fact, she gave so much more detail that this statement, which might have once read as complimentary, seems to curdle into cruelty. In her letters to Dr. Fontenot, Veronica wrote specifically of her own desire, not the mix of attraction and repulsion that Le Fanu repeats over and over. She spoke not of the fear of Carmilla's return, but of a profound desire for it. In contrast to the final beats of Le Fanu's novella, she wrote in her original letters of awaking from daydreams thinking that she heard Marcia's footsteps outside the door. I long for the door to open. I long to feel her run along my skin like so much smoke. I long for her to take me to the place where she went at. Before I turn the page. Oh, it was up here. Footnote 7. It is no coincidence that Carmilla is the name of a Japanese lesbian magazine. Amazing. I long for her to take me to the place where she went at night. Together, we would not be lonely anymore. That's so romantic. In another excised section of the correspondence, she described Marcia as sunlight personified. She warmed me where I had only ever been cold. She took what was fallow and made it fruitful. I did not know that it was possible. I did not realize my soil was not salted. That's so sweet. She spoke of the physicality of arousal, not as metaphor, but as fact, and the tender way the lovers consummated their relationship. My heart beat faster, my breathing rose and fell rapidly, then a sobbing that rose into a sense of strangulation and turned into a dreadful convulsion, she wrote. Footnote 8. This depiction remained in Carmilla, the knots people have tied themselves into to describe it as anything but an orgasm, are almost comedic. Fair point. Later, I descended the valley of her over and over until neither of us could locate our breath. And though she did not witness the execution of her beloved, she dreamt of it. The road that curves through the mist of my dreams is lined with Marcia's body beheaded, she wrote to Dr. Fontenot just before Christmas, 1869. Sometimes her corpse is limp as a doll, as you might expect, but sometimes a cry issues from the open throat. You are mine, you are mine, you are mine. How I fear that sound, that it might be true, and that it might never be true again. That is so romantic. Once Veronica's excised letters are restored to the record, the dimensions of the story become clearer. A young woman's sexual awakening, the senseless slaughter of her supposed defiler, the ecclesiastics and doctors and fathers and uncles and barons and vampire hunters. Excuse me, I have like a gas bubble. No. The ecclesiastics and doctors and fathers and uncles and barons and vampire hunters look less like well-intentioned protectors against a supernatural evil. Their own accounts become highly suspect. This is not to say that Veronica was without her doubts, or Marcia without her wickedness. The latter's seduction of the general's niece is also part of the record, as is his niece's subsequent suicide. Her tendency towards obsession, her single-minded approach to sex, and her worldliness are easy to infer from Veronica's accounts, and it is easy to see how these might have been at profound odds with Veronica's well-being. Yet Marcia also may have been innocent of the more devious charges laid against her. It seems as though Marcia/Carmilla falls somewhere in the historical record alongside Countess Elizabeth Bathory de Essed, the Hungarian noblewoman accused of slaughtering young virgins to bathe in their blood, either an unrepentant predator or an ambitious proto-feminist and the victim of a political conspiracy. Either way, Marcia's love caused Veronica pain. After the first night, I felt as if I had left an old world behind, Veronica wrote just before her death in 1870. But despite the excitement, I missed my old world, where I understood every crevice, every stone. Now I existed somewhere wild and open, a forest much larger than the one outside of the manor house. A forest I could never imagine understanding with any intimacy. Marcia did this to me. Marcia brought me here. So what to make, then, of Veronica's sense of loss? Could it be that, despite the crippling effects of Marcia's affections, Veronica would have rather died than been without her? There is one other strange and surprising detail in the letters, which Fanu excluded for reasons unknown. Throughout the duration of their correspondence, a comet hung in the sky above them. Their back and forth frequently mentions this apparition and the acute strangeness it provoked. It is reasonable to assume that the vivid scenes Veronica paints are partially due to its influence. For her part, Dr. Late theorized that the comet they wrote of was the historical Solo comet, now called Solo 9, as its accompanying distortion and escalation of memory syncs with their accounts. It is the same comet that hangs over us all as I write this essay. It similarly visited Dr. Late in the years following her most important scholarship. The fact that its name mirrors Veronica's profound loneliness is as unlikely tragic as any other detail in this account. Footnote 9. There is also the detail of Dr. Late's eventual suicide in 1984. Logistics. The accompanying text includes footnotes of both a practical and illustrative nature. It is useful, for example, to have a sense of the many provinces and cities referenced here and their historical and contemporary dimensions. The text is edited to reflect a more modern grammatical sensibility where necessary. There are also places where your faithful editor has done her best to interrupt Fanu's passionate and unrequited love affair with unnecessary commas. You are likely wondering why I did not restore the original complexity and length of Veronica's letters to this edition. There are a few reasons. First, there is reason to believe that even the collection of correspondence discovered by Dr. Late was not complete, and I remain eternally hopeful that Veronica's uncensored voice will one day have its due. The second is more complex and infinitely more petty. I wished this edition to bear Fanu's shame. I wish the reader to come to the book with a complete understanding of its inadequacy. Love that. The act of interacting with text, that is to say, of reading, is that of inserting oneself into what is static and unchanging so that it might pump with fresh blood. Having read this introduction, I hope you will enter into Carmilla thusly, using your fingertips and mouth and mind to locate the lacunae where Fanu excised pieces of Veronica's account, the hallways haunted by the specters of truth and phantoms of passion. See if you cannot perceive what exists below, the erotic relationship of two high-strung and lonely young women, the shared metropolis of their dreaming, an aborted picnic in the ruins. Carmen Maria Machado, Taos, New Mexico, June 22nd, 2018. I was not expecting that introduction to be that passionate. Okay. We good? Okay. Prologue. Upon a paper attached to the following narrative, Dr. Hesselius has written a rather elaborate note, which he accompanies with a reference to his essay on the strange subject which the manuscript illuminates. This mysterious subject he treats in his essay with his usual learning and acumen, and with remarkable directness and abridgment. It will form but one volume of the series of that extraordinary man's collected papers. As I publish the case in these volumes, simply for the interest of the laity, I shall not prologue the narrator, and, after due consideration, I have also determined to abstain from presenting any précis of the learned doctor's reasoning or extract from his statement on a subject which he describes as involving, not improbably, some of the profoundest arcana of our dual existence. I was anxious, upon discovering this paper, to reopen the correspondence commenced by Dr. Hesselius so many years before with a person so clever and careful as his informant seems to have been. Much to my regret, however, I found that she had died in the interval. Footnote 1. Enter here knowing that she is already dead. That being said, she probably could have added little to the narrative which she communicates, with such fastidious detail in the following pages. J. Sheridan Fanu, 1871. Hold on, let me adjust myself. Sorry, it's really hot. Chapter 1. An Early Fright. In Styria, we, though by no means magnificent people, inhabit a manor house. Footnote 2. A state in the southeast of Austria. A small income in that part of the world goes a great way. 800 or 900 a year does wonders. Ours would have barely answered among wealthy people at home. My father is English, and I bear an English name. Yet I have never seen England. But here, in this lonely and primitive place, where everything is so marvelously cheap, I really don't see how ever so much more money would at all materially add to our comforts or luxuries. My father was in the Austrian service and retired upon a pension and his patrimony. He purchased this feudal residence and the small estate on which it stands, at a bargain. Nothing can be more picturesque or solitary. It stands on a slight eminence in a forest. The road, very old and narrow, passes in front of its drawbridge, never raised in my time, and its moat is stocked with perch and sailed over by many swans. On its surface float white fleets of water lilies. Over all this, the manor house shows its many-windowed front, its towers, and its Gothic chapel. The forest opens in an irregular and very picturesque glade before its gate, and at the right, a steep Gothic bridge carries the road over a stream that winds in deep shadows through the wood. I have said that this is a very lonely place. Judge whether or not I say truth. Looking from the hall door towards the road, the forest in which our castle stands extends in every direction. The nearest inhabited village is about 7 of your English miles to the east. The nearest inhabited manor house of any historic association, that of old General Spielsdorf, is nearly 20 miles away to the west. I have said the nearest inhabited village because there is only 3 miles westward, that is to say, in the direction of of General Spielsdorf's manor house, a ruined village. There sits a quaint, roofless little church, in the aisle of which, hold on, I lost my place. In the aisle of which are the moldering tombs of the proud family of Karnstein. Now extinct, they once owned the desolate chateau which overlooks the silent ruins of the town from the thick of the forest. Respecting the cause of the desertion of this striking and melancholy spot, there is a legend which I shall relate to you another time. Listen, and wonder, I must tell you now, how very small is the party who constitute the inhabitants of our castle. I don't include servants or those dependents who occupy rooms in the buildings attached to the manor house. Excuse me. I'm gassy tonight, I'm so sorry. My father, who is the kindest man on earth, but growing old, and I, at the date of my story, only 19, 8 years have passed since then. I and my father constituted the family at the manor house. My mother, a Styrian lady, died in my infancy, but I had a good-natured governess who had been with me since then. I could not remember a time when her fat, benevolent face was not a familiar picture in my memory. She was Madame Perrodon, a native of Bern, footnote 3, a major city in central Switzerland, whose care and good nature now in part supplied to me what was lost with the death of my mother. She made a third at our little dinner party. There was a fourth, Mademoiselle de la Fontaine, a lady you might call a finishing governess. She spoke French and German, and Madame Perrodon French and broken English, to which my father and I added unbroken English. We did this partly for patriotism's sake, and partly to prevent its becoming a lost language between us. You may hear my cat lo-fi snoring? ? In the background. Sorry. She is very cute, though. The consequence was a babble at which strangers used to laugh, and which I shall make no attempt to reproduce in this narrative. There was also 2 or 3 young lady friends close to my own age who were occasional visitors. These were our regular social resources, but of course there were chance visits from neighbors of only 5 or 6 leagues distance. My life was, notwithstanding, rather a solitary one, I can assure you. My governesses had as much control as you might imagine they had over a rather spoiled girl whose father allowed her to have her own way in nearly everything. The first occurrence in my life which produced a terrible impression upon my mind, one which, in fact, never has been equaled, was one of the very earliest incidents I can recollect. Some people will think it is so trifling that it should not be recorded here. You will see, however, by and by why I mention it. The nursery, which I had all to myself, was a large room in the uppermost story of the manor house, with a steep oak roof. I can't have been more than 6 years old the night I awoke and, from my bed, failed to see the nursery maid. Neither was my nurse there, and I thought myself alone. I was not frightened, for I was one of those happy children who are studiously kept in ignorance of ghost stories, of fairy tales, of the lore that makes us cover up our heads when the door cracks suddenly, or the flicker of a guttering candle makes the shadow of a bedpost dance upon the wall. I was vexed and insulted at finding myself, I imagined, neglected, and I began to whimper in preparation for a burst of sobs. It was only then that I saw the solemn but very pretty face looking at me from the side of the bed. The young lady was kneeling with her hands under the coverlet. I looked at her with a kind of pleased wonder and ceased whimpering. She caressed me with her hands and lay down beside me on the bed. She drew me towards her, smiling. I felt immediately soothed and fell asleep again. This was the sensation that woke me, as if 2 needles ran into my breast very deep at the same moment. I cried loudly. The lady started back, her eyes fixed on me, then slipped down upon the floor and, I thought, hid herself under the bed. Frightened, I yelled with all my might, "Nurse, nursery maid, housekeeper!" All came running in, and hearing my story made light of it, soothed me all they could meanwhile. But, child as I was, I could perceive that their faces were pale with uncharacteristic expressions of anxiety, and I saw them look under the bed and about the room, peep under tables, and pluck open cupboards. Footnote 4. Imagine, reader, the beautiful woman snarled up in the bed slats, smelling the nurse's breath as she lifted the bed skirt. This editor is really sassy. The housekeeper whispered to the nurse, "Lay your hand along that hollow in the bed. Someone did lie there. The place is still warm." I remember the nursery maid petting me, and all three examining the place where I told them I felt the puncture and pronouncing that there was no sign visible that any such thing had happened to me. The housekeeper and the 2 other servants remained sitting up all night, and from that time a servant always sat with me in the nursery until I was about 14. I was very nervous for a long time after this. A pale, elderly doctor was called in. How well I remember his long, saturnine face, lightly pitted with smallpox scars, and his voluminous chestnut wig. For a good while, every other day, he came and gave me medicine, which of course I hated. The morning after I saw this apparition, I was in a state of terror, and could not bear to be left alone, daylight though it was. I remember my father coming up and standing at the bedside, talking cheerfully, and asking the nurse a number of questions. He laughed very heartily at one of the answers, and patted me on the shoulder, kissing me, and telling me not to be frightened. It was nothing but a dream, he said, and could not hurt me. But I was not comforted, for I knew the visit of the strange woman was not a dream, and knew, instinctively, that she could, in fact, hurt me. I was not consoled by the nursery maids assuring me that it was she who had come and looked at me and lain down beside me in the bed, and that I must have been half dreaming not to have known her face. I remember, too, in the course of that day, a venerable old man in a black cassock coming into the room with the nurse and housekeeper, and talking a little to them, and then very kindly to me. His face was sweet and gentle, and he told me they were going to pray. He joined my hands together and told me he joined my hands together and told me he desired me to say, softly, while they were praying, "Lord, hear all good prayers for us for Jesus' sake." I think those were the very words, because I often repeated them to myself, and for years afterward my nurse would make me say them in my prayers. I remember so well the thoughtful, sweet face of that white-haired old man in a black cassock. I remember so well how he stood in that rude, lofty room, with the clumsy furniture of a fashion 300 years old about him, and the scanty light entering through the small lattice. He knelt, and the 3 women with him, and he prayed aloud with an earnest, quavering voice for what felt like an entire age. I forget all my life preceding that event, for some time after it is all obscure also, but the scenes I have just described stand out vividly as the isolated pictures of the phantasmagoria surrounded by darkness. Wow. This is a beautiful book, I can already tell. But that was the prologue, the introduction, and the first chapter of Carmilla, and I'm excited. I did not think it would be as much of an erotic exploration, but I think I'm gonna enjoy this. I'll see you next time for chapter 2. Bye.